I've always believed in collective organisation. The individual is not as powerful as a group. Never was. That's why lions are more successful, because they work in a pack than the leopard who works on his own.
The leadership should be conscious of this necessity to encourage the maximum participation of the individual member and, of course, the maximum unity of the movement in general. That's where I stand, and that's where I stood.
Jack Jones was the best Prime Minister we never had.
Pentonville, where 5 dockers have been imprisoned for refusing to attend the Industrial Relations Court, thereby breaking the law through contempt of court.
Unless you're prepared to stand up and be counted to defend not just your industry, but your whole way of life and your whole culture, then you're not a member of the working class.
The women themselves were saying, hang on a minute, you know, I'm paying the same amount of money to this union as he is. I expect the same service.
Youth and what we're doing about youth recruitment. That's a major issue for us. It's very important that whatever we say, that we do remind them that the sacrifices of the past that was made by a number of our comrades is exactly the reason why we enjoy some of the benefits we enjoy today.
It's our job, really, to give the history of the T&G, the history of the union movement, how you can move forward and how you can represent people.
In 1922, brave men and women stood up to create the union, and they put self-interest, personal interest, vested interest to one side for the well-being of workers. That's what we're doing now.
Comrades, welcome to Bournemouth. Thanks for coming. Great turnout for this, the very first Martin Rally for our brand new Union Unite. And what a great union we're going to be. Comrades, it's a great day for us because we have a giant, new, progressive fighting back union in our country. And it brings together two of the great cultures of the past. The mix and match of the AU to become amicus, and of course the T&G itself.
Across the whole range of British industry, one trade union, above all, has dominated these scenes of British working life to an extent unparalleled by any other organisation. For most of the last century, that union has been the Transport and General Workers Union, the T&G. It sought to embrace all workers, regardless of whether they were skilled, semi-skilled, or unskilled. It has indeed truly been a union for all workers. The T&G has also had another remarkable characteristic. It threw up an exceptional sequence of great leaders, as well as a powerful rank and file.
Nothing must stand in the way. Money, material, energy. Everything must be used for the supreme effort, victory.
I ask you to look carefully at what is being said. Because if we have this right to possess the nuclear weapons, then every other country in the world has the same right.
A trade union is not Bevan and Deacon. This is the view I took then. A trade union is of the membership. It's a collective.
The trade unions are more important than a Labour government.
The strength in any union is the lay member democracy and involvement. That's where the strength lies in any trade union.
Today, we're going to honour one of those giants, perhaps the greatest in our own legendary Jack Jones. And we meet, unfortunately, just a few short weeks after the tragic death of another great legend of ours in Ron Todd. Ron and Jack, what a history.
The T&G was born on January the 1st, 1922, the creation chiefly of Ernest Bevin. He brought together 14 separate unions of dockers, bus and tram workers, truck drivers, and a range of smaller unions to build one of the most influential groups in the entire British labour movement. Of course, it was the culmination of years of workers' struggle. From the earliest time of the 20th century, Ernest Bevin's genius was to harness this, and that was the foundation stone on which he built the T&G.
Bevin, a great contributor, but he wasn't the only creator. No, he wasn't the sole creator of the Transport and General Workers Union.
Ernest Bevin was called the Dockers KC, a label which came after his stunning victory at the famous Shaw Inquiry of 1920 into the pay and condition of dockers.
Of course, you had Ben Tillett before them, the role indeed in the way back in the Workers' Union development of Tom Mann. Tom was very much for the workers from the beginning, and even at the expense of victimisation. Tom Mann was a great inspiration, yes.
After the First World War, the whole nation was scarred by industrial struggles. Across the entire working class landscape, trade unions were fighting for better and safer working conditions and a living wage, a fight that frequently led to bitter industrial struggle against most employers. Then in January 1924 came the first Labour government led by Ramsay MacDonald, but it was a weak minority government dependent on Liberal support. In October that same year, it fell, barely 10 months in office of course, but never in power. The collapse of the first Labour government was followed by years of great industrial unrest, affecting most industries, but particularly in the coal industry. It all came to a head with the general strike of May 1926. The miners were demanding a living wage. The coal owners wanted cuts. The TUC, in which Bevin was already a prominent figure, tried to give all possible support to the miners, but they were up against massive government strength as well as the refusal of the coal owners to compromise. Behind the employers was the state machinery of police and troops. The strike collapsed after 10 days. The miners fought on for another 6 months until they were literally forced back to work, often starving.
May I introduce to you the members of the cabinet?
Then in 1929 came the election of a second Labour government, again led by Ramsay MacDonald. Stronger this time, but still a minority government dependent on Liberal support.
And Mr. Thomas has got very broad shoulders, as you see, and I can assure you that he is going to have a very big burden put upon him. He is going to look after the work that we are doing for the unemployed.
The second Labour government lasted longer than the first, yet by 1931, a world economic crisis led to its downfall. And in September 1931, MacDonald and a few of his former Labour cabinet colleagues agreed to form a national government with the Tory leader Stanley Baldwin.
If you go back to 31, when MacDonald defected, he went to the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party and they said, Prime Minister, you must do what you think is necessary. The TUC wouldn't do it. And it was Ernie Bevin who persuaded the TUC to come out in opposition to the national government in 31. And then during the 30s played a leading role, and then, of course, during the war was a minister in the coalition and then into the government. I mean, I didn't always agree with Ernie Bevin, but the truth is Ernie represented that mainstream Labour commitment to the Labour Party, trade union commitment, that is now absent.
The trade union movement condemned MacDonald and his followers. It was indeed a great blow to the entire Labour movement, and the strongest voice of condemnation was that of Ernest Bevin, leader of the T&G. In fact, it was Bevin, more than any other single leader, who led the fight back against the national government and in doing so effectively saved the Labour Party for the future. The years following the formation of that national government by MacDonald and Baldwin led to political and industrial tension, such as the strike of pressed steel, a very important area for the T&G. Yet none of those disputes left such a legacy of rancour on the scale of the 1937 Coronation bus strike. It was one of the biggest industrial disputes of the period. That dispute left a deep scar for years to come. The Spanish Civil War, which broke out in early 1937, was in fact the forerunner of World War II. That civil war brought together people from all over the globe to fight fascism, communists, socialists, trade unionists, even liberals. The fight against Franco's fascism in Spain was unique, bringing together anti-fascists from all over the world in international brigades. And the British contingent included a young Liverpool docker, active as a rank-and-file member of the Transport and General Workers' Union, James Larkin Jones, otherwise known as Jack Jones.
Workers were fighting for freedom and fighting for the rights. I was still in the Territorial Army when I went to Spain. So it was an opportunity to, make clear that it meant something more than just talk, to go to Spain and fight. The workers I was with were sympathetic to my point of view, but they weren't as sort of absolutely committed as I would have liked them to be, because, it was a bit far off, as it were, Spain.
Of course, there was a fascist movement in Britain as well, led by Sir Oswald Mosley, a one-time Conservative MP who later became a Labour minister and then deserted the Labour Party to form his own British Union of Fascists in the early 1930s. Mosley and his fascist followers were the focus of fierce street battles up till the outbreak of World War II. Bevin joins Churchill's new war cabinet formed in 1940. He becomes Minister of Labour with wide powers over the entire British workforce.
I must have the help of the employers' associations and trade unions. The nation must be organized. I intend to work through these great bodies, and every employer will facilitate my work if he joins this association, and every worker if he's a member of his trade union. And they should join together to make the maximum effort to produce at this time in order to defeat the Nazi. My message to you is produce for victory.
When Churchill's wartime coalition government broke up in May 1945, after the collapse of Nazi Germany, Ernest Bevin returned to his old job as General Secretary of the T&G. But then in July 1945, Attlee's Labour government was elected with an overall majority for the first time, and Bevin became Foreign Secretary.
It's a very ignoble thing for any Foreign Secretary to negotiate with anybody that you're dependent on. Who wants that position? Who wants it with a trade union training such as I've had? Who built a union on purpose that I could stand up equal to anybody in the world?
The union was controlled by people who had been influenced, rather by being bosses themselves and inclined to appease bosses. And that, I'm afraid, went for Bevin and Arthur Deakin, for example.
Back at the T&G, Arthur Deakin was confirmed as General Secretary. Deakin had been doing that job during the war while Bevin was in the Churchill Wartime Coalition. And Deakin became General Secretary in 1945, fully confirmed, and stayed there until he died in May 1955.
Are you satisfied with the result of your meeting, Mr. Deakin?
Both I and my colleagues of the Executive are satisfied with the conclusion of our meeting. We are naturally pleased that our members have taken the advice of the Executive and the Strike Committee and have decided to resume work.
Deakin had made little contribution other than to follow in the footsteps of Bevan, probably because whatever Bevan had said he agreed with, and he was very much a follower rather than a leader. How the hell he ever got General Secretaryship, I don't know offhand.
Well, I was very junior then, but I recognised the role he played. He just stamped on the union and they had to do what he said. And that's why when you got later Jack and Frank Cousins and later Ron Todd, the whole thing became so different and so exciting.
The Attlee government, elected in July 1945, did indeed create a social revolution. Nationalisation of coal, electricity, gas, the Bank of England, railways, road haulage, and in July 1948, Anara and Bevan launched the National Health Service, yes indeed, a social revolution.
The National Health Service will include family doctors, whom you can choose for yourselves, and who will attend you in your own homes when this is necessary. It will cover any medicines you may need, specialist advice, and of course hospital treatment, whatever the illness. There'll be no charge for treatment.
Clem Attlee relied on Ernie Bevan, and Jim Callaghan and Michael Foote and others relied on the trade union movement to a very large extent, but now that would be a very difficult thing to do because the values and ideas are so contrary one to the other.
The National Dock Labour Scheme was set up in 1947 to end the daily jostling at port gates every day for casual work. It prevents employers from taking on non-union labour and gives the union a major role in hiring and firing dock labour.
Dockers were employed by the National Dock Labour Board and they were hired out on a temporary basis to the employers. I mean, it was a casual system that you never had any guarantees of work. You went down to a dock gate and the employers, the ship worker, called on gangs to do the particular jobs that they had to do. And all that you were guaranteed was half a day's work. You had a position with the Dock Labour Board scheme where there was a lot of solidarity amongst workers because of that, you know, that the scheme was a big improvement.
At the same time, there was considerable unrest throughout the whole of British industry, notably in the docks, but also in the mining industry and in the car factories. It was also a period when the Cold War was beginning to develop. And in the Transport and General Workers' Union, Arthur Deakin seized that moment to ban communists from holding any office in the union. It was known as the Black Circular, and that remained until Frank Cousins and Jack Jones became the leaders of the union and the Black Circular was abandoned.
The straight, sombre road to Golders Green Crematorium was lined by a multitude of mourners for the funeral service of Ernest Bevan. His cabinet colleagues...
On April 14, 1951, Ernest Bevan died. It was the beginning of a very big political change. A general election that same year brought Churchill back and the Tories into government, and they remained for 13 years. On May Day 1955, Arthur Deakin died. His successor, Arthur Jock Tiffin, was elected General Secretary, but within a few months of his election, Tiffin became seriously ill. He was only able to have one biennial delegate conference. Before, at the end of 1955, Tiffin also died, an extraordinary and dramatic death of two of the union's leaders. Frank Cousins had already been appointed Deputy General Secretary to Tiffin, and in May 1956, Frank Cousins was elected General Secretary of the Transport and General Workers' Union with the largest majority following the largest ballot ever conducted in the union's history. It was a remarkable result, and a remarkable man took over as union leader, a man who was to transform the union's policy, take it to the left, but also in the process have an enormous influence and effect on the entire labour movement. Within months of Frank Cousins' election as General Secretary of the T&G, he faced challenges right across the industrial front, in the car industry, in buses and in transport in general. But the big impact of Cousins' election was on the political front. He put himself at the head of the campaign to ban the bomb.
The NEC think that the policies of the Western Alliance and our own country ought to be based on the theory of having the bomb. We think they ought to be based on the opposite theory of not having the bomb.
Well, I joined CND long before my father and the union. I joined CND literally within months of it starting. And I think what finally persuaded my father to take on, quote, the establishment, unquote, was he was standing in Trafalgar Square as the march finally wound its weary way on the second year of the All the Master Marches, and he spotted me in the march, tired and weary, and had marched a long way. And he came off the pavement and joined me. I can't remember if my mother did as well, but my father did. And that was, I think, the moment, and he said it to me many years afterwards, that was the moment when he decided that CND was right and that nuclear weapons were, however you described it, wrong.
Within weeks of Frank Cousins' election as General Secretary, he had to face major challenges right across the industrial field, most of all in the car industry, where the British Motor Corporation sacked 5,000 workers at two plants, Longbridge in Birmingham and Oxford. And of course, it was Frank Cousins who actually prepared the ground for a very big expansion of rank-and-file democracy in the Union. But the real major challenge Cousins had to face was in 1958 with the London bus strike. The Macmillan government policy was to hold down pay rises, especially in the public sector, and the London busmen were first in line to lead the fight against that policy.
No, we've reiterated the policy that we outlined in the TUC at Brighton in 1956. We shall pursue claims in accordance with the requirements of our members.
How far have this week's decisions moved the Union away from the cautious policies of Mr. Bevan and Mr. Deakin?
Well, I certainly wouldn't agree that there can be any set pattern of cautious policies of two men so different in their approach to things as Ernest Bevan and Arthur Deakin. I think we've moved towards more progressive policies, but you can't relate it to the circumstance of any previous General Secretary.
In 1964, Harold Wilson led the Labour Party into government for the first time for 13 years with a very small majority, but Wilson still set up a very strong cabinet into which he invited Frank Cousins, the Transport and General Workers General Secretary, to become the nation's first Minister of Technology. But Cousins was never happy in government or in the House of Commons. He didn't fit very well, and in 1966 he resigned from the Wilson cabinet on the issue of Vietnam and wages policy. Cousins returned to the Union in 1966 after resigning from the Wilson cabinet and remained there until 1969 when he retired, handing over to his chosen successor, Jack Jones, who had been Region Secretary in the Midlands. After retiring, Frank Cousins was to become the founding chairman of the Community Relations Commission, which was set up by the Wilson government in 1968 to improve race relations throughout Britain. Afterwards, Frank Cousins, like his predecessor Ernest Bevin, refused an invitation to go into the House of Lords. With Jack Jones' election as General Secretary of the Union to follow Cousins, another remarkable period began in the history of the T&G. Prime Minister Harold Wilson, having won a second term in 1966, appointed Barbara Castle as his Minister of Labour to devise a new formula to curb strikes. She produced a paper called In Place of Strife. It proposed a long list of measures on strike ballots, cooling off periods in disputes, and a threat of legal action against unofficial strike leaders such as shop stewards. All hell broke loose in the trade union movement. with Jack Jones leading the fight to stop Barbara Castle's and Harold Wilson's plans. In the end, the Wilson government and Barbara Castle had to retreat. They were forced to water down their plans. But Barbara Castle had some successes, notably over equal pay, which she introduced for the first time as a new legislative measure. Of course, there were problems about that, particularly at Ford's, where there's a very big dispute over precisely the issue of equal pay.
They wanted recognition, they wanted equal pay. We wasn't classed as skilled, and they wanted to recognise their skills, if you like. Whatever the union asked them to do, they would do.
We wouldn't have the Equal Pay Act without the Ford sewing machinists, strike action that they took. But nevertheless, in terms of sheer numbers, they were seen as very male-dominated and were in many ways.
The impact of all this in June 1970 led to the fall of the Wilson government and the election of a new Conservative government under Edward Heath. But before this, in 1968, we had the extraordinary outburst from Enoch Powell, who had been a member of Heath's shadow cabinet before the elections.
We must be mad, literally mad as a nation, to be permitting the annual inflow of some 50,000 dependents of the immigrant-descended population.
For some reason which has never been clear, certainly to me, really small groups of workers decided that they needed to champion Powell's calls and took to the streets by way of demonstrations. And it may well be that the NF at the time, from their market links, had some links with dockers that buoyed up this particular issue.
Wait a minute. Now look, be careful about this. Enoch Powell is a Tory. He's an Englishman. That's the point.
It was not typical of working dockers. It certainly wasn't typical of workers in London more generally. It was a very short-run campaign. Didn't have any legs or substance to the campaign. Although it got a lot of publicity at the time, and people still do remember it today.
Yet the Heath government did try to repeat the Wilson-Castle plan to curb strikes, and they produced an even tougher scheme which set up a special industrial relations court to police the whole field of industry, a policy which rapidly led to the threat of a number of strikes and indeed several one-day national stoppages.
And so I believe that these are fair proposals. This is a fair approach, that they should continue to have the wholehearted support of the nation in the battle against inflation. And that is a battle on which the future of the whole nation depends.
This attack is on every industrial worker in the country, whether he's organised or unorganised. And the people outside of the trade union movement better get the message, because it's going to come home to them very, very shortly.
The focal point of this industrial strife centred on the docks industry, where a strike in London led to the sentencing and jailing of 5 dockers, all members of the T&G.
The National Industrial Relations Court, which was set up by the then Conservative government to regulate industrial relations, laughingly, issued an order for their arrest. One by one they were arrested and taken to Pentonville prison, and that led to massive demonstrations and strikes, not just amongst dock workers but amongst printers and an whole range of industrial workers across London and across the country. The TUC General Council actually started to organise for a general strike on the basis of their imprisonment, and suddenly an office that nobody had heard of suddenly appeared, the official solicitor, who went and got them released.
I expected other trade unionists to support us because they, I believed, understood the struggle as it was and what lay behind, you know, the strategy of the then government.
The five of us was put in by a political coup, and it was the trade union movement that got us out.
We was confident that in the final analysis the trade union would stand up and be counted without any shadow of a doubt. We knew that.
Towards the end of 1973, the Heath government was faced by the miners' strike. Not only the miners' strike, but also industrial unrest on a wide scale, 3-day week. There was gas and power shortages, lamps were going out all over the country. Heath decided he would challenge the miners and go to the country on Who Rules Britain. He lost that election, and in March 1974, Harold Wilson was elected for the third time as Prime Minister to lead a new Labour government, albeit with a very small majority. The Transport and General Workers Union was now at the height of its power and influence, and under Jack Jones's leadership boasted a membership of over 2 million members, more than any other trade union in Britain then or since. And Jack Jones himself was then described, with a touch perhaps of envy as well as exaggeration, as the most powerful man in Britain. Wilson was certainly leading a new Labour government, but it was a very difficult period for them. There was a great deal of industrial unrest, economic problems, many of them, and of course the T&G had to face a major sit-in at Imperial Typewriters in Hull.
Well, I went to work for Imperial Typewriters in 1969. In 1974, Litton Industries took over, the American firm, and in February 1975, we'd finished our day's work, I'd gone home, I was preparing the tea, and my telephone started ringing. And lo and behold, it was members who worked at Imperial Typewriters to say that they'd received this letter. We'd no longer to return to Imperial Typewriters, they'd closed down, and we would receive a further letter telling us when to go. We would be allowed to go back in to pick up our belongings.
And a number of women there took a stand, led by Val Byrne, and they occupied the factory.
And when we got there, the management was in the gatehouse, and all of a sudden somebody shouted, "Right, over we go," and 300 of us went over.
That morning when we arrived, and quite frankly, I don't remember the gates being as high as this. The gates was locked, and 300 of us just climbed over the gates. And that was the day of the sit-in, Imperial sit-in began.
And I have to tell you, that sit-in lasted for 6 months.
And it was a very gallant fight. And when Imperial went down and people were sacked and so on, I felt standing by helpless, having given them such support as I could. But it was characteristic of what happened all over the place. People who took a stand about the job they did, the company they worked for, loyalty to the product and their fellow workers, just disposed of because they weren't making the profit at the level the multinational company wanted.
We're determined. United we stand. United we stand. We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved.
The Imperial Typewriter dispute was in itself a remarkable event, a remarkable piece of courage by the workers involved and by the union itself who led it.
But we came out the way we went in, with our heads held high and dignity.
In July 1975, with the country facing serious economic problems, the Labour government under Harold Wilson and the trade union leadership of the TUC organised what was called the social contract. But in 1976, Harold Wilson, already ill, resigned. Jim Callaghan took over. The social contract remained an immensely controversial issue right across industry, both trade unions and employers. Jack Jones fought for it because he believed it was a help to rescue the Labour government from its economic crisis. But at the 1977 BDC of the T&G, Jack Jones' policy was overturned by his own conference rank and file. He accepted that, however painful it was.
Do we carry out our bargain? Do we show our belief in collective decisions? Or do we repudiate our word and become mavericks? I do not think that that is the position this conference wants to adopt.
And all the work he did on the incomes and wages policy and stuff like that, where his back was to the wall because the government were pulling him one way, obviously because of the state the country was in. His members were pulling him another way.
Then came the vote on the militants' motion on whether to reject the social contract and begin free collective bargaining from August the 1st.
Composite 1B is carried.
So Jack Jones had lost and his executive's line had been rejected.
In March 1978, Jack Jones retired, the end of an era. He was succeeded by Moss Evans. The final months of 1978 were terrible months for the Callaghan government, full of industrial unrest. It's called the Winter of Discontent and leading eventually to the fall of the Callaghan government in April 1979. On May the 4th, 1979, Margaret Thatcher was elected to lead a new Tory government. It was the start of a counter-revolution, a revolution against all that the Attlee government had built in 1945. Thatcher sought to undo, notably to attack the trade unions and all they stood for.
I think the nation recognises, indeed has recognised for a long time, that trade union power is out of balance, and that's why people are supporting us in legislating for trade union reform.
Mrs. Thatcher also set out to demolish Britain's old industrial structure, leaving much of the nation we knew, particularly in the public sector, a wasteland. Probably the greatest industrial struggle of the post-war years was the 1984 miners' strike. The NUM, led by Arthur Scargill, struck to prevent pit closures. The Thatcher government were determined to cut back the coal industry, cut down the number of pits, and reduce the NUM to meaningless proportions. As the miners' strike was starting in 1984, the T&G were electing a new General Secretary, Ron Todd, to succeed Moss Evans. One of the first things that Ron Todd did was to declare his backing of the union for the miners' strike.
I want a Labour government. I want a socialist government. But I will not betray the National Union of Mine Workers again.
After 12 months of bitter struggle, the miners returned to work. It was a bitter end to a long struggle, perhaps an historic struggle for the trade union movement.
One of the groups that came out of that really heads held high was the Miners' Wives. And because, you know, lots of women in the T&G organised to help the Miners' Wives, organised collections, went on demonstrations for them. So they were finding niches which met their belief in how you should behave as a trade unionist, what it's really about.
The miners were no more defeated than were their gallant forebears on the Somme. Lions led by donkeys. They should spend the rest of their lives atoning for that fault. Not hawking their defeat from conference to conference.
Wind up, Eric.
I asked this conference, who out there in the real world wants this motion passed?
I've heard reference this morning to lions being led by donkeys. Well, I'm an animal lover. And I'll tell you something, I prefer donkeys to jackals. I move 69.
Fresh from her success over the miners' strike, Margaret Thatcher then pursued other industries, notably in the docks. She was determined to end the dock labour scheme, the scheme that had been devised and developed by Ernest Bevin. Ron Todd, General Secretary of the T&G, fought very hard to maintain the scheme, but failed. Thatcher had won that as the docks situation was being transformed by containerisation and modern methods. In the run-up to his retirement, Ron Todd was determined that T&G would set a pattern of something quite new for British trade unions and arguably any other British institution, to elect a black man to lead the union, Bill Morris.
Good luck, mate. The unity and friendship which I have enjoyed throughout this election demonstrated that colour or race are no real barriers to anyone seeking to serve this union at its very highest level.
When Bill Morris became the General Secretary, I always remember there was this euphoria in the black community, and we were all saying, you know, we never thought it was possible for a black man to be elected into that position, and it was a great feeling.
We represented diversity, all right, yeah, and it was groundbreaking. I mean, you think, you know, a blue-collar union like the T&G to vote in a black General Secretary, that was something.
I believe we have a great culture in the Transport and General Workers Union for innovators in many ways. The fact that we were the first organisation to produce a black General Secretary is a reflection that in spite of all the pitfalls, when we can deliver. And we have to make that happen again.
In 1995, Bill Morris was the first trade union leader to be re-elected under Margaret Thatcher's new legislation, which imposed a requirement on all trade unions to have a ballot for the re-election of their General Secretary.
There have been predictions the result will be close, but in the event, Bill Morris won decisively. The election was seen as a test of union support for Tony Blair's new-style Labour Party, but Mr Morris didn't see his victory as a blow for the Labour leader.
This was not a political election. I was a candidate, Tony Blair was not a candidate, and therefore he's not an issue in this election. He's a valued member of the T&G, like all the other much-loved and valued members that we have, a million of them.
Both Bill and I had been travelling around the place doing stuff with huge numbers of members over a long period of time, and I think people must have trusted us, otherwise we wouldn't have got the vote.
Bill Morris was certainly very successful over the dispute with British Airways cabin crew, far less so with a bitter dispute among Liverpool dockers. Sadly, the Liverpool dockers were unable to resolve that dispute, and for years afterwards there was terrible tension within the union. And in the year 2000 there was great trouble throughout the car industry, but notably over the future of the big Rover plant in the Midlands.
It's another indication that the problem is more deep-seated than just Rovers alone. It is a malaise which is setting in respect of British manufacturing, and we've got to find an alternative strategy to that.
The man who followed Bill Morris was Tony Woodley, a former Merseyside car worker.
We're not prepared to be used in the UK just as workers to be hired and fired as you feel appropriate. We're going to be treated fairly, and whilst you're producing and selling vehicles in our country at the levels that you are, we expect people to be employed in this country producing those cars.
We're all working class people, as are our General Secretaries, and we've turned out wonderful leaders within the T&G. Tony Woodley will be a great General Secretary.
There was another critical dispute at London's Heathrow Airport, the Gate Gourmet dispute. It was the sacking of 700 mainly Asian women working for a British Airways supplier of in-flight food. It was an appalling example of employers' diktat and anti-union policy with the recruitment of non-union agency labour to replace the Asian women. But the T&G fought this under the new leader, Tony Woodley, with great force, and backed by the action from other BA workers, they secured a victory.
There is even more of a need for trade unions today than there was when our forefathers and mothers started even the Transport and General Workers Union. We've got exploitation by the bucketful in every factory and workplace here, with agency and temporary workers being exploited, underpaid, undervalued. Even now, after generations, decades of equalities legislation, the world of work for women means that they're still underpaid by 20–25%. This cannot be.
For us women, all issues are trade union issues. If it affects your family, it affects your working life, then they're all trade union issues. And I have to say, we had a lot of support from many of the men in the union, supporting us for us to take our rightful place. And again, for example, in our own union, we have now got a chair of the executive who is a woman.
I mean, it was brilliant to be the first woman elected, but if I'm a bit egotistical and say it's not bad knowing I'm the last woman as well, there's still a sadness that nobody else, not another woman's going to have this opportunity within the T&G. But there again, there'll be opportunities endlessly within Unite, won't there? And we just have to, you know, make sure that we're at the table always.
As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, it became very clear that the Transport and General Workers Union could not continue as it had been for so long. For its values and idea to survive, it had to form a new organisation, and that became the basis for its new talks with Amicus to form the new union, Unite.
Yes, the new union will be a democratic, organising union for equality, but it will also be a progressive, fighting back trade union. We take into the new union our rock-solid T&G values.
Derek Simpson, the new leader of Amicus, agreed with that perspective, and on that basis, new talks began on the merger.
The 8th of March 2007 was going to be an historical day for our union, for our movement, and indeed for politics in our country. That's the reality of it. We just now received the declarations from the ERS. I hand this over to the chairman of the union to let us all be put out of our misery. Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Tony. Jimmy Kelly was the first chair of the T&G to come from Ireland.
Delighted to be joined by my esteemed comrade here, Brenda Sanders, Vice Chair of our great union. International Women's Day and a great day for this union. Question. Do you approve the instrument of amalgamation between the Transport and General Workers Union and Amicus? Result, voting yes, 86.4% of the valid. Voting no, 13.6% of the valid. So, we declare the result in favour of the new union.
How do you bring these two great organisations together and make them integrate as they should? That's a challenge in itself.
It makes absolute sense, and what you need to do is draw from the best of both unions' traditions and histories to build a new culture, because I think that's what it has to be. It has to be about moving on towards a new united union. That's its name.
This film, this history of the Transport and General Workers Union, has not only guided us on a magnificent journey about the history of a great trade union, but also effectively about the history of the British labour movement in its struggles to improve the conditions of the working class and to produce a more equal society in the 20th century and now into the 21st century.
And let me end by repeating the words of Ernie Bevan when he used it closing the the very first conference of our union back in 1923. We live not for today, but for the future. Gosling, Tillett, Sexton and others laid the foundations of this movement under difficult circumstances. The circumstances are different now, and we've got to carry on, you and I, to another stage in upward development. That is our task in our day and generation, and I beg of you, do not shirk it. I beg of you, do not shirk it.